If someone had told me a year ago that my life, my meticulously ordered, predictably quiet life, would be upended by the man who lived in apartment 2B, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, of course. More of a dry, internal huff of air. A soundless dismissal. Because my life was built on the foundation of avoiding men like him. Men who moved through the world like they owned it, all broad shoulders and effortless confidence. Men who didn't notice the quiet corners or the people who inhabited them. His name was Julian. I knew this from the little metal slot on the lobby mailbox. Giton. He was a paramedic. I knew this from a uniform I sometimes saw him in, a dark blue that made his shoulders seem even wider, the fabric stretched taut across his back as he took the stairs two at a time. He never took the elevator. The elevator was my domain, a slow, rattling cage where I could avoid conversation. My world was books, specifically old books. I ran a small shop downtown called the Dog-Eared Page, a dusty sanctuary of paper and ink. My days had a rhythm. The chime of the bell over the door, the scent of aging vanilla and leather, the soft rustle of turning pages. My nights were just as structured. A simple meal, a book, the familiar quiet of my own apartment, 3B, directly above his. Sometimes I would hear him, the thud of his boots on the floor, the muffled sound of television, the rush of water in the pipes when he showered. These sounds were the only intrusion he made into my life, and they were universe away. He was a physical presence in the building, a collection of gravitational forces and low frequencies, while I was more of a ghost, haunting the periphery. I watched him, of course, from my window as he left for a shift, his jaw set, a deep line of concentration between his brows. In the hallway, where I would press myself against the wall to let him pass, my heart a frantic, stupid bird against my ribs. He would give a short, sharp nod, his eyes, a startling clear gray, flicking over me for a fraction of a second before moving on. He saw a shape, a neighbor, an obstacle. He didn't see me. And that was the arrangement, the silent, unspoken contract I had with the universe. I could look, I could long, but I could not touch. He was a painting in a gallery I could never afford, a story written in a language I would never speak. He was solid, real, grounded. I was footnotes and marginalia. This distance was safe. It was a wall I had built brick by careful brick, and I had no intention of ever tearing it down. Loneliness was a familiar ache, a dull throb I had learned to live with. It was predictable. Men like Julian Thorne were not. My routine was my armor. It was everything. Wake at 6. Coffee black. Open the shop at 9. Lunch at 1. Always the same sandwich from the deli next door. Close at 6. Home by 6:30. Dinner, book, bed. A life lived in neat, straight lines. A life designed to prevent the messiness of human connection. He was all mess, or so I imagined. I saw him once, coming home after a long shift, a smear of dirt on his cheek, and a weariness in his bones so profound it seemed to pull at the very air around him. He didn't look confident then. He just looked heavy. We passed in the lobby, the space between us charged with the ozone of his exhaustion. He didn't nod that time. He didn't seem to see anything at all. That image stuck with me. The chink in the armor. The man behind the uniform. It was dangerous, that thought. It was a crack in my own wall. Because it suggested he wasn't a painting, after all. He was a person. And that was a complication my quiet, orderly life simply couldn't afford. The distance was the point. It was the whole foundation. He was down there, and I was up here, and the floorboard between us were thick enough to keep our worlds from ever colliding. Or so I believed. The disruption came on a Tuesday that had started like any other. The air was thick with the promise of rain. A heavy gray blanket pulled over the city. The shop was quiet. I was cataloging a new collection of pre-war poetry, the delicate pages whispering under my fingers. The day was unfolding exactly as planned. And then my phone rang. The landlord. His voice was tinny and panicked. "Now, there's been an incident." Incident was a word that did not belong in my vocabulary. "The water heater in your unit. The one in the closet?" It burst. Completely gave out. "The tenant below you just called, said water is coming through his ceiling," the tenant below me. Julian. My blood went cold. a torrent of ice water that had nothing to do with a broken heater. "I'm on my way home now," I said, my voice sounding distant, disconnected from my body. My hands were shaking. My routine was shattering. The walls were coming down. By the time I got to the apartment building, the hallway was already a disaster zone. Water was seeping from under my door, a dark, creeping stain on the worn carpet. A man from building maintenance was there, looking grim. He unlocked my door, and the sight that greeted me made my stomach clench into a tight, painful knot. My living room, my sanctuary, was a shallow lake. Water dripped from the ceiling, from the light fixtures. My books, my precious books stacked on the lower shelves, were submerged, their pages swelling and warping into unrecognizable pulp. It was a violation, a desecration, and then a voice came from behind me, a low, calm rumble that vibrated right through the floorboards. "Looks like you've got a problem." I turned. It was him, Julian. He wasn't in uniform, just a plain gray t-shirt and jeans. The shirt was damp, with a large water stain spreading across the chest. His hair was wet. He was looking at the devastation in my apartment. Then his eyes, those clear gray eyes, landed on me. For the first time, he was actually looking at me. "Not through me. It's coming down pretty bad into my place," he said. "Right over my bed." Ironically, he offered a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I couldn't speak. My throat was a desert. All I could do was stare at the ruin of my carefully constructed world, and at the man whose world was now irrevocably tangled with mine. The maintenance guy was muttering about shutting off the main line, about needing days to dry it out, about calling plumbers and restoration crews. "You can't stay here tonight," the man said, stating the painfully obvious. My mind went blank. A hotel. All my things were soaked. My wallet, my keys. I felt a wave of dizziness. "Hey," Julian's voice cut through the panic. He took a step closer. The forced proximity was dizzying. He smelled of rain and soap and something else, something uniquely him. "You okay? You look like you're about to pass out." I shook my head, trying to clear it. I don't know," he sighed, a sound of weary resignation. He ran a hand through his damp hair. "Look, the landlord's not going to get you a hotel tonight. It's already late. My place is wet, but the living room is mostly dry. You can take the couch." The offer hung in the air between us. A lifeline I was terrified to take. Sharing a space with him. It was unthinkable. It was impossible. It broke every rule I had ever made for myself. But then I looked back at the waterlogged corpse of my apartment, and my ruined books. I had nowhere else to go. The floorboards between us had given way, and I was falling. "Okay," I whispered, the word feeling like a betrayal of a lifetime of solitude. "Okay." His apartment was a study in contrasts. The living room, where he led me, was sparse, almost monastic. A worn leather couch, a simple coffee table, a television against one wall. No pictures, no plants, no clutter. It was the apartment of a man who didn't spend much time at home, or perhaps a man who didn't know how to make a space a home. It was clean, but it felt unlived in. Lonely. But then there was the water damage. A large, ugly brown stain was spreading across the ceiling directly over his bedroom door, and a steady drip, drip, drip echoed from inside. He had placed a large cooking pot on the floor to catch the water. The sound was a constant, maddening reminder of the chaos that had thrown us together. "Sorry about the mess," he said, gesturing vaguely at the pot. "It's contained, for the most part. The bedrooms are right off for now. It's my fault," I said automatically. "I'm so sorry," he waved a hand, dismissing it. "It's not your fault. It's the building's fault. These pipes are ancient." He walked into the small kitchen area that was part of the open room. "You want something? Water?" "I think I have tea." I just shook my head, standing awkwardly in the middle of the room. I felt like an intruder, an alien species brought in for observation. This was his space, the space I had only ever heard through the floor. To be standing in it was surreal. He came back with a glass of water anyway and pressed it into my hand. Our fingers brushed. It was nothing, a flicker of contact. But for me, it was a lightning strike, a jolt of pure electricity that shot up my arm and exploded in my chest. My breath hitched. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. He noticed. Of course he noticed. A small frown creased the space between his brows. He looked down at his own hand, then back at me, his gray eyes searching, analytical, the way a paramedic might assess a patient. Is he in shock? I'm fine, I said too quickly. I took a sip of the water, the cold liquid a welcome shock to my system. He didn't press it. Instead, he went to a closet and pulled out a stack of clean, folded linens and a pillow. Here, the couch is pretty comfortable. I've crashed on it a few times after a bad shift. He placed them on the couch, the scent of laundry detergent, clean and simple, filling the air. It was such a normal, domestic act. It felt intensely, terrifyingly intimate. I spent the next hour in a daze, watching him move around the small apartment. He was efficient, purposeful. He called the emergency restoration number the landlord had given him. He spoke in a calm, authoritative voice, the voice of someone used to handling crises. He was all action and forward momentum. I, on the other hand, was frozen. I sat on the edge of the couch, clutching my glass of water, feeling useless. I was a man of words and quiet contemplation. In the face of a physical disaster, I was completely adrift. He finished his call and turned to me. The professional mask dropped away, and the weariness I'd seen before settled back into his features. He looked older than I had thought. There were fine lines around his eyes and a faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a detail I'd never been close enough to see before. "They'll be here in the morning to start with the industrial dryers," he said. His voice was softer now. "It's going to be loud for a few days." "Okay," I said. It was the only word I seemed capable of. An awkward silence fell between us, broken only by the rhythmic plink, plink, plink of water hitting the pot in the other room. It was a physical weight, that silence. I could feel him watching me, studying me. I kept my eyes fixed on a spot on the opposite wall. What does he see? A scared, pathetic man whose life just fell apart. A nuisance who flooded his apartment. "You know," he started, his voice hesitant. "I've seen you." In the bookstore, my head snapped up. "You been to my shop?" A faint flush crept up his neck. "A few times. I don't read much. But it looks quiet, peaceful." He shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the admission. I just stood outside. Looked through the window, he had seen me. He had stood outside my sanctuary and looked in. The thought sent a dizzying, terrifying thrill through me. The one-way mirror I thought existed between us was a window, and he had been looking back. "Why didn't you come in?" The question was out before I could stop it. He stared at his hands. They were large, capable hands, calloused at the palms and knuckles. The hands of a man who worked with his body, who held things together, who held life and death. "Didn't feel like a place for me," he said quietly. Felt like I'd break something, and in that moment, the entire narrative I had constructed about him crumbled. The arrogant, confident man who moved through the world without a care was gone. In his place was someone who felt out of place, someone who stood on the outside looking in. Just like me. The power dynamic, the one where he was the sun and I was a forgotten moon, shifted on its axis. He wasn't just a force of nature. He was a man with his own set of walls. And I had just been given a glimpse over the top. "You wouldn't have," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Nothing in there is that fragile." It was a lie. Everything in there was fragile, including me. He finally met my eyes again, and there was something new in them. Not pity, not annoyance. Something softer. A flicker of understanding. "Maybe not," he said. Later that night, I lay on his couch, wrapped in blankets that smelled of him. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the streetlights, filtering through the blinds, casting long, striped shadows across the room. The dripping from his bedroom had finally slowed to an occasional, lonely plink. I couldn't sleep. My mind was a racetrack of anxieties and revelations. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, was magnified in the unfamiliar quiet of his apartment. I could hear him breathing from the other room, a low, steady rhythm. He had insisted on taking the floor in his water-damaged bedroom, rigging up a makeshift bed with couch cushions. A gesture of kindness that left me feeling even more unbalanced. I was in his space, his private world. The barrier between us, the one I had relied on for so long, had been completely obliterated. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. Around 2 in the morning, a sound tore through the quiet. A choked, guttural cry from his room. It wasn't loud, but it was raw with a pain that made the hair on my arm stand up. It was followed by a sharp gasp, then frantic, heavy breathing. A nightmare. My heart hammered against my ribs. Don't get involved. It's not your place. Pretend you're asleep. The old rules. The safe rules. But the sound of his ragged breathing continued. A desperate fight for air in the darkness. I thought of the weariness in his eyes, the weight he seemed to carry on his shoulders, the things he must see every day, the lives he held in his hands. Before I could second-guess myself, I was on my feet. I moved silently across the living room, my bare feet cold on the wood floor. I paused at the doorway to his room. "Julian," I whispered into the darkness. The breathing stopped. Silence. Then his voice, rough with sleep and something else. "Fear. Now, what is it?" You made a sound. I thought you were heard." A long pause. I could just make out his silhouette, a dark shape sitting up on the floor. "Bad dream," he said, his voice flat. "A dismissal. Go back to sleep, I should have. I should have retreated back to the safety of the couch. But I stayed, rooted to the spot. I was the one who was supposed to be a mess, the one who needed help. But here, in the dark, he was the one who was unraveling. Do you want to talk about it?" The words were absurd as soon as they left my mouth. People like us didn't talk about things like that. I expected him to tell me to get out, to mind my own business. Instead, after another long silence, he just said, "No," but then he added, so quietly I almost missed it, "Just don't go." "Not yet," so I sank down to the floor, leaning my back against the doorframe, my knees pulled up to my chest. I didn't say anything else. I just sat there, a silent sentinel in the dark. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, two strangers sharing a wounded silence. He was in his corner, and I was in mine, but for the first time, we were in the same room. The space between us was no longer an empty void. It was filled with a shared, unspoken vulnerability. Eventually, his breathing evened out, returning to the slow, deep rhythm of sleep. Only then did I allow myself to creep back to the couch, my body aching with a strange, protective tension. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, and knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that nothing would ever be the same. The floorboards had not just been breached, they had been vaporized. The night bled into a gray, hazy dawn. I hadn't slept, not really. I had drifted in a state of hyper-awareness, cataloging every sound, every shift in the atmosphere of the apartment. When I finally heard Julian stir, my entire body went rigid. The intimacy of the night, forged in darkness and nightmares, felt fragile. I worried it would shatter in the harsh light of day. He emerged from the bedroom, rubbing the back of his neck. He was wearing the same clothes he'd had on before, now rumpled from a restless night on the floor. He didn't look at me at first. He went straight to the kitchen and started making coffee, his movements stiff and deliberate. The silence was different this morning. It wasn't the awkward, uncertain silence of the evening before. This was a heavy, deliberate silence. A wall being rebuilt, brick by painful brick. "There's coffee," he said, his back still to me. "Thank you," my voice was a croak. I felt like a ghost at a breakfast table, unsure if I was even visible. He poured 2 mugs, then finally turned to face me. The vulnerability of the night was gone. In its place was a cool, professional distance. The paramedic was back, the man who handled crises and kept his emotions locked down tight. His gray eyes were guarded, unreadable. He handed me a mug. This time he was careful. Our fingers didn't touch. "The restoration crew will be here at 8, he said, his tone clipped, informational. "I have a shift at 9. You can stay here while they work. Just try to stay out of their way." It wasn't a question. It was a set of instructions. A dismissal. My heart, which had been doing a frantic, hopeful flutter, sank like a stone. "He regrets it. He regrets letting you see him like that." "Of course," I said, my voice small. "I'll be out of your hair as soon as I can find a place." He gave a short nod, already pulling away, already moving toward the bathroom to get ready for his day. He was closing the door on last night. On me. The brief connection we'd shared was being treated like an anomaly, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. I sat on the couch, the warm mug in my hands a poor substitute for the warmth I had felt sitting in his doorway. I felt foolish. I had mistaken a moment of weakness for a moment of connection. For him, I was just a problem to be managed, a flooded neighbor who needed a temporary fix. When he came out, he was transformed. Dressed in his dark blue uniform, his hair combed, his jaw set. He was the man I had always seen from a distance, impenetrable and self-contained. He looked at me, a flicker of something. Was it guilt? Regret? In his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Lock up when you leave," he said, grabbing his keys from a small bowl by the door. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the silent apartment. I was alone in his space, surrounded by the ghost of an intimacy that had apparently only existed in my own head. The smell of his coffee, the sight of his worn leather couch, the blankets that still held a faint trace of his scent, it was all a form of torture. The restoration crew arrived, two loud, cheerful men who filled the apartment with the roar of industrial fans and the smell of ozone. I retreated to a corner, feeling like a piece of forgotten furniture. I spent the day on my phone, calling my insurance, calling hotels. The world was back to its transactional, impersonal self. By late afternoon, I had found a room in an extended stay hotel across town. It was sterile and anonymous and perfect. I packed up the few dry belongings I'd salvaged, folded Julian's blankets neatly, and placed them on the couch. I wrote a short, stilted thank you note and left it on the coffee table. I didn't have his number to text. I didn't have any claim on him at all. I let myself out of his apartment, locking the door behind me. The sound of the lock clicking into place felt final. A full stop at the end of chapter 1 had completely misread. The next 2 days were a blur of beige walls and bad hotel coffee. My solitude returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a comfortable, familiar cloak. It was a cage. The silence in my hotel room wasn't peaceful. It was empty. It was defined by an absence. By his absence. I kept replaying our brief time together. The brush of his fingers. The quiet admission that he'd seen me at my shop. The raw, broken sound he'd made in the dark. The way he had asked me to stay. Had I imagined it all? Had I projected my own desperate longing onto a simple act of neighborly kindness? The self-recrimination was a bitter pill. I was an idiot. A lonely, pathetic man who built fantasies out of stray glances and accidental touches. He had a life, a demanding, important job. He didn't have time for whatever it was I thought was happening between us. He had opened his door to a neighbor in need, and I had tried to crawl inside his soul. I didn't hear from him. I didn't expect to. The landlord texted me updates about the repairs, but there was nothing from apartment 2B. The silence was absolute. It was confirmation. It was a verdict. On the third night, I was sitting on the lumpy hotel bed, staring at the television without seeing it, when my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I almost ignored it. I answered. "Hello. Lau." The voice. His voice. It was low, tired, and it sent a shockwave through my entire system. My hand tightened on the phone. "Julian?" "Yeah. Hey." "The landlord gave me your number." "I hope that's okay. It's fine," I said, my heart doing that stupid bird thing again, beating itself senseless against the cage of my ribs. I saw your note," he said. "You didn't have to leave. I told you you could stay. I found a place," I said lamely. Didn't want to be in the way. A pause. I could hear the sound of traffic in the background on his end. He must be in his car. "You weren't in the way," he said, and his voice was strained. I was an asshole. That morning. I get weird after a bad night. Another confession. Another crack in the armor. "It's okay," I said, even though it wasn't. "No, it's not," he insisted. Things got complicated. And I'm not good with complicated." He let out a long, weary sigh. It was the sound of a man at the end of his rope. "Look, can we talk?" "Not on the phone. I'm getting off my shift now. Can I come to you?" My breath caught. He wanted to see me. After 2 days of agonizing silence, he was choosing to close the distance. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But underneath it, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to sprout. "Yes," I said, the word coming out stronger than I expected. I'll text you the address. The hour it took for him to arrive was the longest of my life. I paced the small hotel room, smoothing the bedspread, tidying the already tidy desk. I looked at myself in the mirror. I just looked like me. Pale, a little too thin, with worry lines etched around my eyes. What did he possibly see in me? A knock on the door made me jump. I took a deep breath, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I opened the door, and there he was. He was still in his uniform, but it was rumpled, stained with things I didn't want to think about. There was a deep exhaustion carved into his face, shadowing the sharp planes of his cheekbones. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. He looked broken. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there in the harsh fluorescent light of the hotel hallway, his gray eyes searching my face. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice rough. I stepped back, holding the door open. He walked past me into the room, and the sterile space was suddenly filled with his presence, with the smell of antiseptic and city streets and his own unique scent. He didn't sit. He just stood in the middle of the room, looking as out of place as I had felt in his apartment. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming out in a rush, "for how I acted, for just leaving like that. It was shitty." "There's no excuse. You don't have to apologize," I started, but he cut me off. "Yes, I do." He ran a hand over his face, his fingers trembling slightly. "That night, the nightmare, it was a bad one. A kid. We lost a kid on the way to the hospital." He said it flatly, a statement of fact, but the pain behind the words was a chasm. "And I woke up, and you were there, and you had just sat with me. You didn't try to fix it. You didn't say it would be okay. You just stayed." He looked at me then, and his eyes were raw, stripped of all their defenses. "No one's ever done that before," he whispered. "Everyone wants the hero, the guy who has it all under control. My parents, my colleagues, they see the uniform, not the man. They see the guy who saves people. They don't see the guy who can't sleep because he hears a mother screaming her child's name over and over again." My chest ached with a sudden, overwhelming wave of empathy. All this time, I had seen him as a monolith of strength, and all he had ever wanted was permission to be weak. "And I freaked out," he continued, his voice cracking, "because you saw me. You really, actually saw me, and it scared the hell out of me. So I did what I always do. I pushed it away. I put the uniform back on and pretended it didn't happen." He took a hesitant step closer. The space between us crackled with unspoken things. "These last 2 days have been hell. Every time I closed my eyes, I wasn't just seeing the bad calls. I was seeing you, in the bookstore, in my hallway, sitting in my goddamn doorway in the middle of the night. And the quiet in my apartment was wrong. It wasn't peaceful. It was just empty." He was echoing my own thoughts, my own feelings. The same loneliness, the same sense of a vital presence suddenly missing. He stopped right in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He smelled of exhaustion and a desperate, fragile hope. "I came here tonight," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense murmur, "because I don't want to be that guy anymore. I'm tired of being a uniform. I'm tired of being alone. I just wanted to feel seen again. By you, and that was it." The final brick in my wall turned to dust. This powerful, capable man, this man I had placed on a pedestal, was just as lonely and afraid as I was. We were both just standing on the outside, looking in. I didn't think. I just acted. I reached out, and my hand found his, my fingers lacing through his. His hand was large, rough, but it closed around mine with a gentleness that made my breath catch. The contact was electric, a current of pure, undiluted connection. He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at my face. A universe of questions passed through his eyes. I answered them the only way I knew how. I leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a frantic, passionate kiss. It was slow, hesitant. It was a question and an answer all at once. His lips were chapped and tasted faintly of coffee. He was stiff at first, a moment of pure shock, and then he melted into it, a shudder racking his entire frame. One of his hands came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me there as if he was afraid I might disappear. It was a kiss of shared solitude, of mutual recognition. It was the sound of two lonely worlds finally tentatively colliding. It was quiet, and it was honest, and it was the most real thing I had ever felt in my entire life. When we finally broke apart, we just stood there, foreheads resting against each other, breathing the same air. Our hands were still tightly clasped between us. "Leo," he breathed, my name a prayer on his lips. "It's okay," I whispered against his skin. "I see you, he didn't leave that night." He showered, washing away the grime and trauma of his shift. And when he came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a too small hotel towel, he looked younger, softer. The harsh lines of exhaustion had eased around his eyes. We didn't talk much more. The words had been said. The important ones, anyway. He crawled into the unforgiving hotel bed, and I laid down beside him. He turned on his side, facing me, and just watched me in the dim light filtering in from the parking lot. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice laced with a vulnerability that was still so new, so startling. I just nodded, reaching out to trace the faint scar on his eyebrow with my fingertip. He flinched almost imperceptibly at the touch, then leaned into it, his eyes fluttering shut. "Stay," he murmured, the word a soft echo of his plea in the darkness of his apartment. "I'm not going anywhere, I promised." He fell asleep within minutes, a deep, exhausted sleep. One of his hands found mine in the space between us, our fingers loosely intertwined. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of his steady breathing, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of him in the bed next to me. The fear was gone. The anxiety, the lifetime of carefully constructed walls. It had all been replaced by a quiet, profound sense of rightness, of coming home. The next morning, I woke up first. For a terrifying second, my old anxieties flared. The morning after dread, the fear of waking up alone. But then I felt the warmth of him beside me, the weight of his arm slung over my waist. He was still there. He hadn't vanished with the daylight. I watched him sleep. His face, in repose, was unguarded. The tough, confident facade was completely gone, leaving only the man beneath. The man who felt things so deeply he had to build a fortress to contain it all. The man who thought he would break fragile things. When he finally woke, he blinked slowly, his gray eyes hazy with sleep. He saw me watching him, and a slow, shy smile spread across his face. It transformed him. It was like the sun breaking through a week of storm clouds. "Hey," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Hey," I smiled back. There was no awkwardness, no recoil, no rebuilding of walls. There was just a simple, comfortable quiet. Later that day, while he was on the phone with the contractors, I saw him gesture to the empty space on his keyring. He looked over at me and raised his eyebrows in a silent question. My heart did a slow, powerful turn in my chest. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. When we finally moved back into our respective apartments a week later, the first thing he did was walk upstairs to my door. He held out his hand. Lying in his palm was a newly cut key. "In case the power goes out again," he said, but the smile in his eyes told me it was for so much more than that. It was an invitation, a promise, an anchor. I took the key, its metal cool against my skin, and gave him the spare to my own apartment. An equal exchange, a quiet, binding contract. Our new beginning wasn't a sudden, dramatic explosion. It was a slow, gentle dawn. It was in the small, quiet moments. Making coffee together in my kitchen, my apartment now, his preferred sanctuary because it was filled with the soft, peaceful things he lacked. Him, sitting on my comfortable armchair, actually reading a book I recommended, his brow furrowed in concentration. Me, learning to read the subtle shifts in his mood after a tough shift, knowing when to talk and when to just sit with him in a comfortable silence that was no longer a weight, but a blanket. He filled the empty spaces in my life I hadn't even known were there. My quiet routine was no longer a shield. It was a foundation on which we were building something new. He brought a gentle, welcome chaos to my order. I brought a quiet calm to his storm. Sometimes I would watch him, sleeping on my couch after a grueling 24-hour shift, the lines of stress temporarily erased from his face, and I would feel an overwhelming surge of love so powerful it almost hurt. He was the plot twist I never saw coming, The unexpected chapter that redefined my entire story. I had spent my whole life in the quiet margins, believing that was where I belonged. I built my walls high, convinced they would keep me safe. But Julian didn't tear them down. He just stood on the other side and spoke a language of quiet vulnerability I never knew I understood. He showed me that true safety wasn't in solitude. It was in being seen. Truly, completely seen by the one person you never thought would even notice you were there. My quiet, orderly life was over, and I had never, ever felt so wonderfully, beautifully alive.